1. I have been working at a department store for the past 2 years. Although retail wasn't something I wanted to necessarily do, it was much better than my previous job in the food business, so I was grateful to not have to touch food all day, and would take the world of customer service much more gratefully than the food industry. It was in the middle of January, and the store is usually quite dead towards the end of the day. Usually the following month after Christmas is never really busy, due to people probably trying not to spend money after the gift-giving season. And the cold weather of the winter season in Canada never really helped the situation much. People not in the mood to leave the comfort of their own houses in the middle of a snowstorm. That meant that they put less people on shift, and I was alone in the fitting room. I work at a pretty big store, and alongside the weather conditions, that meant that the employees were usually spread out on the floor, not within close proximity in comparison to what they put during the busy season. None of us wore earpieces, as we did most of our packaging through the speaker system. It was a Wednesday night around 8, and the store closed at 9. I was usually put on the cash register, but often frequented the fitting room when they needed the help. It was a very busy night, and I spent the first couple of hours of my shift helping organize the beauty section that is right next to the fitting room, or go speak to my lovely co-worker who worked in the jewelry section, helping the few customers that actually wanted to try clothes on when they came by. There was a man who came to the fitting room with 2 dress shirts, and I didn't think anything of it. After all, he was nothing I'd never seen before. Older, tall, kind of stocky, muscular, plain. I did notice that he seemed dressed rather nicely, a clearly expensive suit, and a nice shoulder bag. I assumed he must have come to the store after his day at work. I counted the number of articles he was bringing in, as that was mandatory in order for me to monitor the flow of clothes and try to stop theft, handed him a number corresponding to the number of articles he was taking in, and asked him politely to put the clothes back on the hanger in French rather than English, because Quebec requires us to speak French first to customers, to which he replied with a simple no problem. I noticed he had a thick accent, although I wasn't and still not able to place my finger on it. I think it might have been Russian, but I can't say for sure. The man walked into the fitting room, and I didn't think much of it. I helped the other customers who came out of the rooms, counting the articles they came out with, and matched it with their numbers, and hung them back on their place on the rack. A few moments passed by, and the man came out, not really putting much thought into it. I took the dress shirts from him, he didn't want any of them, and took back his number, said thank you, and turned to place the clothes on their rack. Usually this was the point where the customer would just leave the fitting room, but when I turned around to go back to the front, he was still there. I asked him if there was anything I could do for him, or if he still wanted the shirts that I had just put away. The man smiled and looked at me, not answering, and I felt a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. He was looking at me as if he wanted to say something, and me, being the 5'4" girl who hates confrontation of any kind, just nervously laughed and started to organize the desk at the front of the fitting room entrance, awkwardly arranging the numbers, although they were already in order. He asked for my name, to which I just looked down at the name tag I was wearing and repeated it. He told me it was a beautiful name. I laughed nervously, never knowing what to do in these sort of situations, and being nice to him was part of my job in customer service. Besides, he didn't do anything wrong, just complimented me. I said thank you, and looked away, avoiding eye contact. He then just stood there, for what felt like 20 minutes, but in reality was just 3. He stood there as I helped other customers, and was beginning to make me very uncomfortable. Not wanting to be rude, but also not wanting to subject myself to being uncomfortable for the rest of my shift, or however long he was planning to be there, I asked him if there was anything else he needed help with. Here's where I began to get scared. He then proceeded to tell me that he will be waiting for me at 9:30 outside the doors of our store. He wanted to take me out. Confused, I looked at him oddly. How did he know that we finished at that time? The store closed at 9, and we usually spend 30 minutes cleaning up the store. I suppose that information isn't hard to guess, but it still felt weird. Why did he want to take me out? I once again laughed nervously because that seemed to be the only thing I was able to do when uncomfortable, and politely declined, saying I had to head home and study. He laughed, taking a step closer towards me, and I instinctively took a step back. He didn't accept that answer because he just smiled once more. I'll be waiting for you outside the door when all the employees leave from in the truck alley. I'll be there. There was a door that employees exited the mall from because the normal doors usually locked around 9:15. And we always finished later than that. So we take the door that takes us in a slight alley where all the trucks go to drop off shipments for our store. Being someone who hates confrontation, and who doesn't do well with controlling my emotions, I felt myself start to tear up at his compliment. No employee is allowed to mention the door we leave from. It's a company rule. Since we usually finish late and the parking lot is dark, they don't want anyone to know where we exit from as a precaution. I told him once more that I appreciated his offer, but I wasn't interested, and I had to continue my work. I politely told him to leave when he put a hand on my shoulder and I felt myself freeze up. I remember praying that one of my coworkers would show up and pick up the rack, or the jewelry employee would stop filling the cases and turn around. Obviously, with my luck, nobody did. He told me I was a pretty girl, and he couldn't wait to meet me in the alley at the end of my shift. He said he has a nice apartment and had a cute dog, as if the dog was going to make me change my mind, and we could have a fun time. Desperate, I said I have a boyfriend and he was going to pick me up, hoping that would deter him. But he just laughed. He said my name and told me that wasn't something that usually stopped him, placing his hand on my shoulder this time. I honestly really began to feel scared and excused myself to use the phone on my desk, shaking his hand off me that I hadn't realized was gripped on me so tightly. I paged the number for my coordinator, who curtly replied before I was even able to get a word in that she was busy with a customer, and hung up, unsure of what to do as the man was still next to me as he followed me to my desk. I called my manager, who thankfully replied. When he saw that I was speaking with someone on the phone, he left the fitting room, but that didn't make me feel any better. I told my manager what had happened, and with good reason she freaked out, telling me I need to report him immediately, reminding me that with people like that, I really have to be careful. She told me to call security, which I did, and the security guard told me he had an eye on him through the camera. It was around 8:30 at this point, and I was getting ready to start my closing tasks, still paranoid about what the man had said. To be fair, I am a paranoid person and I watch way too many murder documentaries, so I may be overthinking. This sounded like the beginning of an abduction movie, honestly. I kind of calmed down, not seeing the man anymore, when the security guard called me back. He wanted to let me know that the man had never left and was circling the store. I felt more dread than before pop up in my stomach. He didn't leave. Thankfully, he hadn't come back to see me. I felt kind of better for the fact that the security guard had seen him, so if anything did happen, there was someone who was able to identify him. Once again, overthinking. By the time the store closed and it was time to leave, two of my coworkers, Evan and Ethan, two boys who worked in the warehouse, made sure to walk with me all the way to my car, not letting me be alone. I appreciated it a lot. Although I didn't want to admit it, I was scared walking through that alley, and I was even paranoid he was going to follow me home. I took the extra long route to see if anyone was trailing me, which he wasn't. When I walked through the safety of the door of my house and locked it behind me, I let go of a breath I wasn't even aware I was holding in. I make sure now to always leave the store using the buddy system. I never walk alone, and I always make sure I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings. I never wear my name tag anymore. Luckily, nothing happened to me, and maybe I was overthinking the entire experience. But I wanted to stress that even if your job is in customer service, if someone makes you uncomfortable, speak up. You should not have to be subjected to this behavior at your work, or anywhere for that matter. Again, to the creepy man who wouldn't leave me alone in the fitting room. Let's not meet again. 2. I, 18 male, moved from my hometown in with my mom about a year ago, now into a farmhouse pretty much in the middle of nowhere on the east side of Australia. It was at the very end of a 7-kilometer-long driveway that had like 2 other houses on it, both with elderly couples in them, and a 30-minute drive from the nearest town, which is very small, only having about 1,000 people living there. I'd feel really uncomfortable some nights when I was outside having a cigarette. The old feel like you're being watched, and occasionally would wake up and hear footsteps outside that I was sure did not sound like the sheep and rams that were right near our place. I have a history of drug abuse, and I'm quite a paranoid person because of it, so I tried to rationalize it all by telling myself I was just being paranoid. One night I woke up at 3 a.m. and needed to take a piss. When I looked out my bedroom window and very briefly saw a flash of light, like it had come off a torch or a phone. Seeing as though we lived in the middle of fucking nowhere, this freaked me out a lot, and I stayed up until morning listening and looking out, but heard nothing. Maybe a week later, my stepdad's ride-on lawnmower had its tires slashed, which my stepdad blamed on me, but I didn't care because it just further enforced the idea that there was somebody lurking around our property. My mum knows I wouldn't do something like that, and instead thought the neighbor had done it. I always chatted with the neighbor when I went for walks, and I liked him, and really doubted he would have done it, let alone be able to walk that far, as he was quite old, and if he came in a vehicle late at night we would have heard it. Stepdad ended up moving out, and I don't mean to get too personal. He's a drinker, and I witnessed him on the verge of being violent with my mum and intervened and, well, fucked him up a little. So he moved out the next day, and we haven't seen him since, thankfully. And no, the things that happened after he was gone were 100% not him. It wasn't even considered to us that it could be him because it just wasn't. Trust me. With him gone, and it only being me, Mum, and my 3-year-old sister there, and considering we can't legally own a gun in Australia, and the cops would take a good hour to get to us if we needed them, I got increasingly paranoid about the things that had been going on, because I felt I had to be protective. Some nights I would stay up very late, and before going to sleep, would turn off all the lights and walk around silently, looking out the windows for any signs. Probably looked like such a crackhead, and sure enough, on a few occasions I would see torches off in the distance, in the middle of the cow paddocks, as if somebody saw all the house lights turn off and started making their way over at 3 a.m., which is weird to say the least, considering that in every direction other than towards the other houses on our road, there was absolutely nothing but bush and paddocks for a good 20 kilometers. I should add that our front door didn't properly lock and could easily be opened by just messing with the handle a bit. So I started putting a wheelbarrow up against the door and a metal sheet behind the wheelbarrow, so if the door opened, it would make a very loud noise that would definitely wake me up. A few weeks went by, and heard absolutely nothing, so I began to get much less paranoid and was thinking about it a lot less. One night I had gotten back from the pub and was a bit drunk, still on my phone, in the lounge room. All the lights were off because Mum and Sis were asleep, and I was just laying there texting whoever and listening to music. We have 2 cats, and on this night they were frisky and running around wildly. So when I heard the metal sheet I had on the front door slam on the ground, I figured it was just the cats and ignored it and walked straight past it to my room, maybe half an hour later, not even giving it a glance. The next morning my paranoia immediately came back in full swing, and I proceeded to freak out when I saw that not only had the sheet fallen over, the door itself was ajar and the wheelbarrow had moved a good 6 inches as well, which there's no way in hell either of my cats could have done. The only explanation I have for this is that somebody tried to let themselves in, heard the bang and ran off. A few nights after this, my mum woke me up late, maybe 4 a.m., to ask me to come out to her car with her because all of her car lights were on, and she didn't want to go out by herself. We went out and turned it all off and brought the keys, which we usually just leave in the car, inside with us. The car battery was dead, and we had to get our neighbor to come down with jumper cables the next day. She was certain she didn't leave any of the lights on, and all the doors were shut, meaning somebody went inside, pressed the button on the roof, put the key in the ignition on accessories, and exited and closed the door, with what we think was the intention of draining the battery. She began agreeing with me that somebody was lurking around the house and told me a few things she had noticed that she just didn't want to tell me because I was already anxious about it all, and she didn't want to make it worse. Like when the tank water started tasting funny, and she found a dead, half-decomposed possum on the grate on top of the tank. She didn't mention how she couldn't possibly see how it could have ended up there, unless it happened to die right there on that exact spot. And somehow it didn't start making the water taste funny until it was so decomposed you could see its bones. And how a garden rock was moved in a weird position right outside her window, as if somebody was using it to stand on to look inside. The house closest to the road had multiple dogs, and the one that I was friendly with, who lived closer, maybe 3 kilometers from us, had a gun and often shot rabbits and foxes, so that definitely makes us the easiest target. All of this made us both very concerned, and we ended up finding a house and moving out about a month later. I know this is anticlimactic, but it still freaks me out, and I can't think of any other explanation than that there was somebody lurking around our house for a couple months. There were many times where nobody was home all day, so if they wanted to steal from us, they easily could have come in and taken all of our stuff, but nothing was ever missing. Might just be overthinking it, but I truly think they had some very sinister intentions, and were intentionally just fucking with us. 3. This story took place over the last 3 months, having ended less than a month ago. In the final 2 weeks, things took a dramatic turn that I'm still trying to fully process. 3 months ago, my roommate Chloe and I moved into a perfect apartment in a 6-unit building on a street we immediately fell in love with. Chloe and I are both in our early 20s who moved from a small town to a major city in the last 5 years, so we felt like real adults living in this space. Within the first couple of weeks, we began to suspect we were in close proximity of an ongoing domestic dispute between the tenants in the unit upstairs. At this time, we hadn't seen or met them, so really had no idea of the context of the relationship. A man's loud, angry ranting with no shortage of aggressively insulting comments, stupid bitch, cunt, etc., responded with inaudible mumbles prompted us to think a woman may be in a potentially violent environment. Chloe and I decided we would try and listen in case things escalated too far, and maybe try to offer the woman help in the meantime, that is, if we ever met her. Over the next 6 weeks, we continued to hear him, but we hadn't seen anyone and there were no real developments. When he was really loud, we tried to record him on our phones. One Sunday afternoon, I was home alone cleaning my kitchen, which was at the back of our unit. The man upstairs was having a very loud and long rant, and for the first time I heard a clear response. I could make out a woman's voice telling him to shut up and leave her alone, in an almost annoyed rather than fearful tone. He did not appreciate that, and began yelling at her, which eventually led to him banging something against his floor. Eventually, he did one so hard that my kitchen lights began to flicker, and I could see debris falling from the ceiling. This freaked me out, and I called my boyfriend Ted. When Ted answered, I whispered into the phone, "Don't say anything, just listen." The man upstairs continued to yell, but it wasn't until there was another bang that Ted could hear. I said into the phone, "That's my upstairs neighbor. He's been going on like this for a long time. I've been trying to record some of it." Here's where the story really takes a turn. Considering how clearly we could hear him upstairs, it makes sense that he could make out what was being said below him. All 6 units were connected by a subway outside of the back of the building, and I heard very loud steps running down them. Next thing I know, there are 3 heavy raps on my back door and an angry, "So you can record my conversations but you can't answer the fucking door?" I was instantly paralyzed and worried he would come by the open window where I was standing. After about 20 seconds, I heard the steps run upstairs and that familiar voice call up, "No one's home." I collected myself from the shock and fear of what just happened and left my apartment to make some calls. I decided to phone my landlord first, as he seemed like he would want to know if we were having issues with another tenant, and I was very confused about what was happening. I told him the chronology of events since moving in, and he provided me with some very interesting information. The tenants above us were mother and son Rita and Ivan. Ivan is 36, and him and his mom had been living in the building for 10 years. During that time, Ivan had never had a job, and in the last couple of years had caused some problems for our landlord. Specifically, him and the previous tenant of our unit, who had moved out over a year ago, had butted heads several times, which was why our landlord had decided not to mention anything to us. He knew Ivan had issues, but assumed it was an isolated and contained issue. The last thing the landlord told me was that while the previous tenant was in our unit, Ivan had approached him, accusing her of installing something in his wall to listen to him. Maybe I'm dense, but this didn't set off immediate alarms that something more serious was going on with Ivan. I was still believing the woman's voice I heard belonged to someone in danger, so I called the city non-emergency police line, who sent a car over to make sure she was safe. She was, and they promptly left. After our call, the landlord began to build a case to evict upstairs neighbors on the grounds they were impeding the other tenants' ability to enjoy their space. Things upstairs had been mostly quiet for 2 days until I was in touch with landlord again over the phone. He provided me more information, specifically that he believed when Ivan was ranting, it was towards the previous occupant of our unit rather than Rita. This obviously seemed odd to me, but we were still trying to piece everything together, so we had to keep an open mind. The landlord also reiterated how Ivan had really changed in the past couple of years and had caused problems before. His reasoning for not giving us a heads up before moving in was that since the last tenant had moved out, he had been quiet and kept to himself. In the days after this call, the ranting started up again as we waited for an update on the eviction process. That Friday, we received confirmation that Rita and Ivan had been served with their first warning of eviction, so we expected to hear some action. Sure enough, that night while I was in bed, I heard Ivan's voice from above. "Shh, I'm trying to listen." At this point, I'm definitely concerned, but really had no idea where this was going and how quickly. The next evening, Chloe called me while I was at work to tell me she thought she heard a knock at our back door. I told her I wouldn't be home for a couple of hours, but if she was concerned, I could leave early, or she could call the non-emergency line. Chloe told me she was going to see if anything happened and that she would be okay. Around 10 p.m. I came home, and by midnight I was on the phone with the non-emergency myself, because Ivan had come downstairs to my back window where I was standing, asking us to leave him alone because we were harassing him. Chloe and I had been in our kitchen talking about our days, having agreed we were going to try to live our lives despite the situation. At one point, the subject of upstairs briefly came up, and the next thing I knew, the man I had only ever physically seen once with long, dark, greasy hair and a look of emptiness in his eyes was standing at my back window next to where I was sitting. My immediate response was to pull out my phone and start recording him. "Yeah, you can record me," he said. "Can you leave me alone? You and your friends harass my home every day." This got my adrenaline going, and suddenly I heard myself call back, "Bye, Ivan." I called the police, and we waited for them to arrive. When he went back upstairs, he started ranting to Rita and said some very weird and unsettling things. He said we were sexually harassing him, and that us, landlord, and previous tenant were all associated. He then mentioned the bat we have outside our back door, which he wouldn't have seen at the window, therefore had listened to us mention it. He also knew my name, having only ever seen me once. The police arrived and essentially told us there was nothing they could do. They knocked on Ivan and Rita's door, however no one answered, and they stayed silent. The officer advised us to go to the station the following day and have a specific officer assigned to check in on us and monitor everything. They left, and I called my boyfriend to come by and stay over for the night. In the hour after the police left, Ivan ranted sporadically, repeating much of the same things we had been hearing in the past week. Ted came over. He heard for himself what was going on and agreed it was very unsettling. Banging came from upstairs, and Ted said he was going to go out back for a smoke, and that if Ivan came outside to call 911. Ted had injured his back the previous week and was concerned Ivan was going to try to come downstairs again, so he brought the baseball bat. Minutes later, Ivan had come outside and was standing at the top of the stairs, yelling that he was going to knock us out. He started coming down the stairs when Ted picked up the bat, telling Ivan to stay upstairs. I called 911 and our downstairs neighbor came outside to help us, having heard the commotion. The police arrived and I experienced some of the saddest minutes of my life. For starters, when the police went upstairs this time, Rita answered and completely defended her son. The woman we had initially been concerned was at the receiving end of domestic abuse, told officers we were not leaving her son alone, and that he had almost been attacked by my boyfriend. The police said that there was nothing they could do, and left us for what felt like bait in order for our concerns to be taken seriously. They left. We heard Ivan amp up again, this time saying he was going to kill those fucking bitches downstairs. So we packed up and left for the night, each staying with a friend. That was a tough night, as we both came to realize this apartment we had thought was so perfect had a pretty fatal flaw, and we had no idea how this was going to end. We met up the following day, and after encouragement from our families, we went to the police station needing real help with a potentially dangerous situation. It was eventually arranged that charges were to be placed on Ivan for uttering death threats. Chloe and I each gave a testimony, and the officers told us they would be going to the apartment to arrest Ivan. They advised us not to stay there for the night, if possible, in case he refused to be taken by them, and this could escalate things. Without a warrant, the police had no way of forcing Ivan to go with them, but I had a feeling he would, since I had heard him mention at one point that he was the one protecting their home. Sure enough, when the police came to the building while we packed overnight bags, Ivan let them take him away despite his mother's protests, which included accusing us of lying and threatening them. We packed up our things, watched him get taken away, and we left, never spending another night at that apartment. Since all of this, there have been a few updates. First of all, we moved, and landlord was very generous in his reimbursement, to having us know Ivan had issues that he greatly underestimated. Aside from not wanting to be sued, I really believe landlord to be a good guy who just made a judgment call that went completely wrong. We have received a few updates on legal proceedings, both from the charges that were pressed and landlord's eviction process of Rita and Ivan. Ivan was released the following day on bail with a number of conditions, and we're waiting for a court date, I guess. Landlord is also waiting for a court date, having filed all the pre-required documents. The final piece to this completely bizarre sequence of events was the Facebook profile we found. Having looked him up on a whim, Ivan hadn't posted in 3 years, which lined up with the timeline of when landlord said he began causing problems. He had some unsettling posts that we provided to the police, in addition to frequent mention of a relationship he was in. He has dozens of posts about the person, with no response, including likes on any of it. It's strictly posts made to an anonymous person who had no interactions, nor did anyone else. Having researched what I believe Ivan is suffering from, I am curious if this relationship ever existed, or if it was another delusion. That's the story. If you made it this far, thanks for listening, and Ivan, and Rita, let's please never meet again. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 452. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Well, Cyber Monday today, and I've been waiting patiently to see if the TV that I've got my eye on goes down any cheaper, so hopefully today is the day. If not, I'm probably still going to get it, but I'll grumble slightly as I make the purchase. Still, that being said, my current TV, which admittedly does still work, it's just, it's been through the wars. It served me for 8 years, so, if I get at least the same out of the next one, perhaps more, I'll be content with that. Okay, and I'm going to wrap it up there because I've got lots and lots to do. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.